For Muslims attacking Christianity, the Gospel of Barnabas is a very appetizing choice. Do you have problems with the Gospels in the New Testament? Do you think that something fishy happened at the Council of Nicaea? Are you trying to find Muhammad in the Gospels, but just can't seem to do any better than the Holy Spirit in John 14? The Gospel of Barnabas is like polemical Play-Doh that can be molded to answer just these sorts of questions and more. It's almost too good to be true. To begin, let's see how Muhammad Atta-ur-Rahim leverages the Gospel of Barnabas. As regards the various references to the Gospel of Barnabas, which are known to have been made during the course of the last 18 centuries or so, and which accordingly confirm that such a gospel was written and did exist, even if it no longer entirely exists in its original form today, it has been well established that the Gospel of Barnabas was accepted as a canonical gospel in the churches of Alexandria up until 325 AD. Now, if you're wondering what citations he provides as proof for his claims, there are none. He continues, "The official confirmation of the victory over the true followers of Jesus by Paulinian Christianity was enshrined, as we have already seen, in the outcome of the famous Council of Nicaea, which was held in 325 AD, when the Roman Emperor Constantine decided that the Paulinian version of Christianity represented the true teachings of Jesus, and that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John should become the officially accepted Gospels, and that all other Gospels, including the Gospel of Barnabas, were to be destroyed, along with whoever was found to have them in their possession, a decision which resulted in many of the early Gospels being lost for good, and millions of Unitarian Christians being martyred in the years that followed." If you're wondering what citations he provides as proof for his claims, there are none. He continues, "Thus, once the doctrine of Trinity had been formally adopted and declared to be the official doctrine of the Pauline Church, one of the inevitable consequences of this decision was that out of the 300 or so Gospels extant at that time, only the 4 which were selected as the official Gospels of the Pauline Church were permitted to survive. The remaining Gospels, including the Gospel of Barnabas, were ordered to be destroyed completely. It was also decided that all Gospels written in Hebrew should be destroyed. Edicts were issued stating that anyone found in possession of an unauthorized Gospel would be put to death." If you're wondering what citations he provides as proof for his claims, there are none. This should not come as a surprise, since what you just heard is fiction. Before we move on, I want you to note something that I've previously mentioned on this channel. In their contrived polemics, Muslims will parody problems with their own religion, many of them without even knowing it. This is just what they're trained to do. It distracts them from their own issues as they engage in bogus polemics against others. So let's summarize some of the claims you just heard and compare them to problems that many modern Muslims struggle with. Muslim problem: Ibn Mujahid decided what Quranic readings would be canonical hundreds of years after Muhammad. The Muslim polemic that parodies this, also known as the "hey, look over there" technique, hundreds of years after Christ, the Council of Nicaea decided what would be in the New Testament. Muslim problem: variant readings of the Quran continued to multiply over the centuries. Thus, several efforts were required by Muslim scholars to limit them. Hey, look over there. There were originally hundreds of accepted New Testament Gospels, later reduced down to just a few. Muslim problem: Uthman and al-Hajjaj, among others, destroyed Quranic manuscripts that they disagreed with. And the Muslim parody polemic: all of the rejected Gospels were destroyed after Nicaea. Muslim problem: authorities like al-Hajjaj and Ibn Mujahid used violence to reinforce their preferred readings of the Quran. Muslim polemic: people possessing the banned Gospel of Barnabas were destroyed. So Muslims, think about these polemics that you've been taught to repeat. There's a good chance that some of them are specifically designed to distract you from problems in your own religion. Back to the Gospel of Barnabas, which Yusuf Ali couldn't resist either. Further, there were other Gospels that have perished, but of which traces still remain, which were even more specific in their reference to Muhammad. And there it is, the Gospel of St. Barnabas, of which an Italian translation is extant in the State Library at Vienna. But you may observe that there is still a massive problem between the New Testament Gospels and the Quran that we haven't even discussed yet, namely that the Quran is widely interpreted to deny the historical fact of the crucifixion of Jesus. But you've probably already guessed. Yep, Gospel of Barnabas to the rescue. Yusuf Ali continues, the Gospel of St. Barnabas supported the theory of substitution on the cross. The Quranic teaching is that Christ was not crucified nor killed by the Jews, notwithstanding certain apparent circumstances which produced that illusion in the minds of some of his enemies, that disputatious doubts and conjectures on such matters are vain, and that he was taken up to Allah. The Gospel of Barnabas also serves numerous other polemical purposes, but you can see by this point that the Gospel of Barnabas is simply polemical paradise. It's too good to resist. I see it referenced on my channel and get requests from people who encounter Muslims still using these arguments. But even without doing any research, one may get the impression that the Gospel of Barnabas is a bit too good to be true, that it was composed much later than the 1st century or the 7th century for that matter. One may get the impression that it was written in a milieu where Muslim polemics had much time to develop, where Muslim engagement with the actual New Testament was much more thorough, and problems with the Quran's claims about the gospel were much more well known. Indeed, this is the case. Gordon Nickel writes, the Gospel of Barnabas is the name given to a pseudepigraphic Islamic book written in the late Middle Ages or early modern period. The book is not a gospel in the sense of a good news account of Jesus based on eyewitness testimony and written during the years following his death and resurrection. Rather, a European Muslim composed the book more than 1,500 years later, some 900 years after the rise of Islam. But even so, during the past century, many Muslim writers have claimed that this book is the authentic gospel and have used it to try to discredit the fourfold gospel in the New Testament. This polemical effort provides a striking example of how some people willingly disregard the importance of historical evidence when their only purpose is to attack. We have the Gospel of Barnabas in Italian and Spanish. It was referenced in an English translation of the Quran in the 18th century and later began to be translated into other languages. And as we've heard, these translations reached the eager eyes of Muslim polemicists. Nickel continues, the incomplete Spanish manuscript of the Gospel of Barnabas contains a preface in which the writer claims he discovered the book in the 16th century and took it to be a gospel written by the Barnabas named in the New Testament. However, recent historical research argued that the document originated in Spain in the 16th or 17th century. The existing Spanish manuscript dates from the 18th century, and no Greek, Hebrew, or even Arabic manuscript of such a gospel is known to exist. Most scholars consider the text a forgery. In spite of this careful scholarly research on the manuscript, Muslims continue to use the Gospel of Barnabas in polemic against the Bible. In the introduction to their 1907 translation of the book, Lonsdale and Laura Ragg listed the basic reasons why the manuscript must be considered a forgery. However, a number of Muslim publishing houses published the translation without the Ragg's introduction, instead claiming the book's authenticity. How's that for deception? Claims about its authenticity did not take long to spread. Odborn Lervik notes, in 1907, W.H. Temple Gardner, a missionary scholar in Cairo, reported that Muslims in Egypt and India were already indulging in wildest talk regarding the historical value of the book. Translations from English soon appeared in both Arabic and Urdu. In the early 20th century, Lonsdale and Laura Ragg identified the Gospel of Barnabas as a forgery, as you've heard. Remember, that part was left out by Muslim publishers in an act of blatant dishonesty. Likewise, in George Sale's 18th century translation of the Quran, the Gospel of Barnabas was identified as a forgery. From its introduction, repeatedly, across centuries, it was identified as a forgery. Sale's introduction states, "This Gospel of Barnabas contains a complete history of Jesus Christ from his birth to his ascension, and most of the circumstances of the four real Gospels are to be found therein. But many of them turned, and some artfully enough, to favor the Mohammedan system. From the design of the whole and the frequent interpolations of stories and passages wherein Muhammad is spoken of and foretold by name as the messenger of God, and the great prophet who was to perfect the dispensation of Jesus, it appears to be a most barefaced forgery." Fortunately, not all Muslims tried to use the Gospel of Barnabas. Some of them find evidence for its forgery simply too compelling to ignore. We have a couple of examples throughout the 50s and the 70s, and for some modern examples, let's start with Shabir Ali.
Well, many Muslims became interested in this Gospel of Barnabas because it depicts the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as being foretold by Jesus. Jesus says, "After me will come one, and his name will be Muhammad." And the other issue is that the Gospel of Barnabas depicts the crucifixion event in a way in which many of the Muslim commentaries on the Quran depicted that event, in that somebody else was changed to look like Jesus, and that someone else was put on the cross, while the persecutors of Jesus thought that they killed Jesus, but in fact they crucified somebody else. So Muslims were very interested in the Gospel of Barnabas for these two reasons. However, I hesitate to use it as an authentic account because the way in which Muslims authenticate matters is by having a chain of authorities to relate a historical event. And the chain of authorities in the case of the Gospel of Barnabas is missing because for many hundreds of years, this gospel was not seen anywhere, and then suddenly it turned up in the Middle Ages. So because of that break in continuity, we can only know that there used to be a Gospel of Barnabas at one time which became banned, and then it was missing for many hundreds of years, and then suddenly a copy turns up somewhere. Is this a real copy of the original Gospel of Barnabas, or is this something new that somebody else composed in the name of Barnabas, one of the early Christians? One cannot say for sure, and because of this, I hesitate to use it as an authentic account of the life of Jesus, on whom be peace.
Muslim author Mustafa Akyol is another example. He refers to an 18th century mention of the Gospel of Barnabas in the following way. He says, "The Gospel of Barnabas is considered by most scholars as a pious forgery, apparently written in the 15th century by some unknown Muslim author to help support the Quranic view of Jesus." The date you just heard, the 15th century, is approximately what you see in scholarly literature, just depending on which manuscript of the Gospel of Barnabas is being discussed. Jan Justin, who argues that the Italian text is the original, states that existing internal evidence points to the 14th century. Some scholars argue for even later. On the basis of his doctoral dissertation from 1992, Barnaby Pons has published studies on the content of the Gospel in 1995 and a critical edition of the Spanish manuscript in 1998, proposing a 16th or 17th century Morisco background for the Gospel of Barnabas. His work has been considered a major breakthrough in critical research about the alleged Gospel. Muslims will want to argue that this late medieval forgery, the Gospel of Barnabas, does preserve an early authentic 1st century Gospel. About the only hope they have of this is appealing to the 6th century anonymous Gelasian decree, which does indeed mention a Gospel of Barnabas, along with a number of others. Given the names mentioned in this document, it could be difficult for a medieval forger to pick an appropriate name not listed. If this coincidence proves anything, it's that forgers sometimes write under the same name. Any attempt at arguing that the late medieval Gospel of Barnabas preserves an authentic 1st century original is hopeless. There's no conclusive evidence confirming the assertion of some authors who argue that the extant text of the Gospel of Barnabas builds on and preserves older, even primitive Judeo-Christian source materials. Most scholars consider the text a forgery and point to the medieval or early modern elements. The author does, however, build on earlier Muslim anti-Christian polemics and gives the text the outward appearance of a proto-Quran. This is a good time to pause and think about the hypocrisy of the Muslim polemical enterprise. Let's consider a few polemics that we hear ad nauseum. Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic, but the Gospels are written in Greek. But it doesn't seem to matter that the Gospel of Barnabas only exists in Italian and Spanish. This is particularly hypocritical, since the Gospel of Barnabas contains sections where Jesus talks at length about Greek philosophical concepts. So, Gospels written in Greek, problem. But the Gospel of Barnabas in Spanish and Italian, containing Jesus' alleged Greek philosophical discourses, not a problem. Seems too convenient. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus. However, the Gospel of Barnabas is late medieval, well over 1,000 years after Jesus. Nobody knows who wrote the Gospels. However, nobody knows who wrote the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospels contradict the Quran, so we can't trust them. However, the Gospel of Barnabas contradicts the Quran. For example, the former denies Jesus is the Messiah. There is some irony in this last point. The Quran calls Jesus the Messiah. The Gospel of Barnabas denies Jesus is the Messiah, but calls him Christ, which is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word for Messiah, and therefore contradicts itself. So while the Gospel of Barnabas and the Quran disagree about Jesus being the Messiah, they are both aligned in their ignorance of the meaning of the word. So I guess they kind of agree. And Odborn Lervik notes another inconsistency. Contrary to their keen interest in biblical criticism, Muslim apologists have shown little interest in source critique of their alternative Gospel of Barnabas. So as the Gospel of Barnabas was being made known to the Muslim world, it was also being made known as a forgery. In spite of that, arguments based on the Gospel of Barnabas were frequently employed in Muslim polemics. This happened even at the academic level, in Muslim publications and in Muslim universities. Aside from the hypocrisy issue, the Gospel of Barnabas gives us a look at some unfortunate characteristics so prominent in Muslim polemics. Facts do not matter. If the evidence is against them, they ignore it. Spread the polemic, make it popular, get the majority of the Muslim world to repeat it until the echo chambers are saturated. Lervik once again makes a plea for reality. Forging a different witness from the past in order to harmonize early Christianity with Islam is good for nothing. The claim that the Gospel of Barnabas represents the only genuine version of the life of Jesus may be understandable as a countermeasure to Christian imperialism. Here he's referring to the milieu in which the Gospel of Barnabas was likely produced. But it is not justified by it. It runs contrary to the conscience of the historian, which must also in this case seek to protect the integrity of the past. If historical research is to have any value at all, it must be possible to conclude that a certain manuscript, like the Gospel of Barnabas, is not of ancient, but, in this case, of late medieval or early modern origin. The Gospel of Barnabas in so many ways is a conspicuous example of embarrassingly bad polemics that flourish in the Muslim world. Such polemics collapse upon the slightest examination, which means, Muslims, you're not supposed to examine them. You're supposed to shut your brain off, ignore the evidence, and repeat what you've been told. If you do this, like a good robot, you'll never realize your polemics are not legitimate, and, more importantly, you'll never think to ask what problems in your own religion those polemics are hiding. Thanks for watching.